Hello and welcome to analysis of Game 10 of the Chess World Championship. Fabiano Caruana plays white in this game and Magnus Carlsen plays black. Game starts off with pawn to e4 and Carlsen responds as he has in every game where he's faced e4. He responds with c5, which can lead to some open and interesting positions. The knights develop. In previous games, three of them in fact, Caruana had brought his bishop up to b5, creating the Rossolimo variation, but he hadn't really seen much joy with that, so it wasn't a surprise to see him do something a little bit different this time around. The pawn to d4 offers the exchange in the centre and really kind of breaks things open in the central areas of the board. Knights develop and we arrive at the Sveshnikov variation. The pawn kicks the knight away and it moves up to b5. A knight on b5 generally in the early stages can of course threaten to fork the king and rook here on c7. The queen's currently protecting that, but it's never a bad idea to be threatening that square with the knight in the opening. Pawn develops and the knight comes in here to d5. This now renews this threat of the fork on c7 because one knight can move onto that square, and if the queen takes, then the other knight simply retakes the queen. So this is now posing a real threat, which essentially forces black to capture. It's certainly not a bad move, but it's really his only move at this point. And the pawn recaptures, threatening the black knight up on c6. Normal wisdom for the opening is to develop your pieces, get them into the centre of the board as soon as possible where they can have an impact on the game. So black's decision to relocate his knight back to its starting square on b8 does seem a bit strange, but clearly the nature of the pawn structure and the position means that he's got an exact idea and a precise square in mind that he wants to relocate that knight to in the long term, and the quickest way in his mind is to move it back to b8 first. The a4 pawn comes up to support. Bishop develops, development, and castles. This knight then moves over to d7, beginning its planned expedition to a new square. And then b4 comes from white, and this is an unusual move. It's not ever been seen in one of Caruana's games before. It's a very rare move in general in this position. And really it provides support for the a5 square. You might say that, well, the rook is already doing that job, but the problem is when the pawn to a6 move arrives and kicks this knight away, ideally in order to sort of stay active on the best squares on the queen side, the best way for this knight to do that is to relocate to a3, hoping to push a5, and then there'll be a hole here on b6, an outpost where this knight could jump into, supported by the a5 pawn, and that gap is created purely by the a6 push from black to kick the knight away in the first place. So his knight being driven away looks like a bad thing for white, but it actually creates that space he wants to eventually post his knight on. And to do that he'd have to relocate to a3 and then over to c4 and then up to b6 with this pawn on a5, but in doing so he would block this rook's support of the pawn on a5, which is why the pawn move to b4 is certainly a good move, because it achieves that extra protection and it doesn't matter that the rook is going to be blocked when the knight reroutes. So a6 does arrive, the knight relocates to a3 as planned, And then Carlsen pushes the pawn to a5. Essentially this is plans to sort of take away that square from white. Yeah, he can capture the pawn, and black can then recapture, but he can't then form a chain of pawns on the queen side that all support each other, because there's going to be a hole on the b file, and that is exactly what happens. Rook recaptures. The knight develops to c4 as planned. The rook's moved back. Development. And then Carlsen starts to begin a strong counterattack. I mean, the main thing in his favour in this situation is that he has 4 pawns over here on the king side against white's 3 pawns, and this is a pawn majority that he's going to look to immediately exploit to create a powerful attack on the king side. Caruana continues as planned on the queen side by pushing the pawn to a5. Carlsen continues with his attack on the king side, ignoring the threats on the other side of the board, and moves to f4. The bishop then relocates to b6, and the original plan was clearly for the knight to go there, but Caruana's decided that he wants to move the bishop here, drive the black queen away, and create threats potentially against the d6 pawn here, which is already threatened by the knight. If the bishop moves into c7, then it's attacked twice, and it's difficult to really get any more defenders onto that pawn. So the black queen is driven away to e8. The problem with this is that Caruana's really driving the queen over towards the king side where threats are brewing, and really that's exactly where Carlsen is going to want his queen to be in the long run. And the rook comes up to a3. The idea of this is to take control of this open third rank, particularly the f3 square. This stops black from pushing this pawn forward to f3 for the time being. He's already got support from the rook. If he can push this next pawn forward to e4, he gives extra support for this pawn push on f3, which would potentially start to pull open the defences around the king, as well as threatening the bishop and driving that away. All sorts of threats starting to come together here. So the queen then relocates to g6. This now adds extra pressure down the g file, aiming directly at the king. More importantly, it pins this pawn here on g2. So for instance, if f3 comes now, this pawn can't capture because it's pinned. The king will just be moving to check. So even more pressure starting to build. Caruana then carries on with his plan to attack this d6 pawn over on the queen side, and the supporting pawn push e4 then arrives. The king moves over to h1. Basically this is just getting itself out of the line of fire, freeing up the g2 pawn to be able to recapture if the pawn push to f3 arrives, which it inevitably will do. So now Carlsen goes b5. The ideas behind this are pretty interesting. At the moment, if he were to push this pawn, the pawn could recapture. If the e-pawn then recaptures, the bishop recaptures, the rook captures, and then the white rook can come in and make the final recapture, and white would be safe. So really black needs another attacker to apply pressure to this f3 square, and the only obvious choice he has really is this knight up here on d7. If he can get that down here to e5, he's then putting more pressure on this f3 square, which allows him to then make that push. But the problem he has is that he can't go to e5 because the white knight on c4 is covering that square. So in order to create more opportunities in this corner of the board, he pushes a pawn in the complete opposite corner of the board, which is really shows the brilliance of Carlsen in many ways. The idea is to drive away this defender, which the b pawn is now threatening, and then that will free up the square for the knight to come into e5. He does of course open the door for white to recapture en passant, but if that happens, then of course rook captures rook, and this knight is forced to recapture, which removes essentially two of the defenders, the rook and the knight, and yeah, he's removed two defenders instead of one, so as an ulterior plan, that doesn't really work for white. There's nothing he can really do to keep all his defenders adequately there to keep black at bay. So instead, white decides preemptively to remove his own defender, and do so in such a way that threatens the rook and this knight simultaneously. The knight wants to come to e5, but it can't now because it would lose the rook if it were to do so, or even if he were to move the rook out the way, white would probably capture the white bishop, and then black's bishop pair is taken away, which kind of takes a little bit of the impetus out of his attacking prospects long term, and maybe gets white a little bit closer to safety. So black's only real move is to capture this knight, which he does. White recaptures with the bishop, and now Caruana has basically solved the problem of this extra supporting knight coming to e5 by choosing the way that his own defender is removed, which will lead to the potential attacker also being removed, which is just excellent play. The queen then comes down to g5. The idea behind this really is black wants to bring another piece into play on the king side that's currently quite inactive. He'd like to bring the rook here down to f6 and then swing it across to either g6 or h6, just providing more pressure down here on the king side. g3 arrives, and Caruana later in the press conference said he felt this was a mistake as soon as he'd made it, and it's clear to see why. With this light squared bishop hoping to come into the game and join the attack soon, he's basically weakened the light squares here around his king, which isn't a particularly good idea. It also takes the defender away from this f3 square, which that pawn was doing a job there, and allows the push to f3 to come, which then sort of shuts the rook out of the defense, drives the bishop away. It threatens this square, which means that the white king doesn't have anywhere immediately to flee away to. Its castle is in danger of becoming its tomb, really, and it just adds more to black's attack, really, and his options. b4 pushes the rook away to b3. Simply a preemptive move. He wants to advance his pawn forwards because the further it gets down the board, long term it could pose more threats, and he doesn't lose any time by doing so because he's attacking the rook and forcing that to then move. So why not add that move in as well for long term plans. And then the light squared bishop comes down to h3. The rook comes over to g1. It's providing extra cover to this square. Now if the pawn push does happen, there's two attackers on this square, but with the king and the rook defending it, white can just about survive. The pawn push of course comes, and then the bishop moves down to f1. It seems that, g3 was perhaps a mistake, but it seems like it changed Carlsen's plan of attack. Instead of bringing this rook round and swinging this over to the king side to provide extra pressure, it seemed more natural in that moment, with the weakening of the light squares, to bring this light squared bishop in instead. In actual fact, if he'd stuck to the rook moves, he probably would have had a more powerful and telling attack. But now he's in a situation where the light squared bishop for white comes back, offers up the trade, and he has to either back out of the h3 square completely and reorganize his attack, or trade them off. Carlsen then makes what's another probably an inaccurate move. He accepts the exchange, and now the light squared bishop that he had would have been a key problem that he could pose white in the long term on these light squares with the support of the pawn and the queen, of course. But now that's come off the board, it alleviates the pressure. In doing so, he does give himself a free pawn in the centre of the board, and in some ways you have to feel like he's starting to hedge his bets a little bit here. He's going to have 3 connected pawns in the centre of the board, eventually moving this pawn to d5, creating a chain here in the centre where white doesn't really have too many pawns to stand in the way, and he manages to grab a pawn in the process. So rather than sort of backing out of his attack, reorganising, trying to attempt something more elaborate, he's just sort of sat on the fence a little bit and said, well, maybe I can still do that in a while, but if I just grab this pawn first and create space to get a few pawns moving in the centre, maybe I can just give myself more long-term opportunities there. It's not as ruthless and as direct as he could have been. Queen moves back. And a slightly inaccurate move again here, with the bishop moving back to d8. The exchange happens, which it sort of gets white's passed pawn off the edge of the board. It gets it supported by his rook, and it starts to pose more threats of queening to black. Gives him more counterplay really, and takes one more attacking piece off the board for black, which makes it harder for him to launch a checkmating attack on the king. And the rook comes in to defend. Queen. The queen moves in to attack the rook. And rook to b7, which creates space for the rook over on the f file to come and support. Attacks the pawn. And then queen to e2. This is a really interesting move with a lot of tactical threats. There's a few different things that could happen. There's a threat of checkmate immediately here, and there's a threat of simply capturing here. If the pawn recaptures, then there's a passed pawn coming through here supported by the rook. There is even variations where it can seem like black has his queen completely trapped, but he manages through a tactical sequence of moves to actually checkmate white, and this all comes down to this pawn here that he managed to get to f3, shutting off this g2 square, which means that checkmates on this back rank here are a big threat for white, and tactical combinations are certainly in play here. And both players were short on time at this point, so for Carlsen to even see the opportunities potentially behind this move, and for Caruana to also see them and defend against them, just shows the quality of the players really. The rook comes in to defend, and the exchange of queens takes place, which is then unavoidable once Caruana doesn't fall into the trap. And the central pawns start to move, h4, creating some space for the king to now wriggle out of danger and get involved in the game. And from this point it starts to really it starts to swing more in white's favour. Black was posing massive threats through large parts of the middle game, and he does still have these pawns that are looking dangerous in the centre, but black has to put a lot of resources into defending this pawn on b6, or defending against it rather, because if it gets to the other end of the board, then the game is over. So both players have their threats. It's relatively balanced, but if anything, as the game goes on, it's white who begins to play for the win. And here the move a4 comes in, giving check to the king. There's actually, I believe, combinations where he could actually be checkmated if he moves to c3. But Carlsen sees this, of course, and simply just starts to retreat his king back up the board. The computer here says that white has a bit of an edge. However, in the end, the pieces begin to be traded off, and the position fizzles out to a draw. This is perhaps the most exciting match, the most exciting game we've seen in the match. White did have some chances to press for a win towards the end. Black had a huge opportunity during the middle game. If he'd been his normal self that we've seen throughout his career, he would have just broken open the position and checkmated Caruana. But we're looking at a Magnus Carlsen who's not in great form, and he then accepted a quiet draw in game 11, which seems to suggest that he's just happy to try and get this to tiebreakers now and win that way, which is risky, but we shall see if it succeeds.